my scribbles. Started in a minute, so and they're just ushering a few people in.
10 minutes. So figured we'd get right into it.
I think I only take 2 minutes.
We are going to be so right on time on this. We got to have it nailed.
Good morning and welcome to Power Experts. I think we're going to kind of get things started now. Everyone seems to be around and in place. It's a pleasure to be hosting this meeting of professionals from right across the power generation industry, and we at World Arena are delighted that you have chosen to join us today. Power Experts is a growing success, and so thank you to everybody that's speaking and being a part of the presentation, because you're helping to grow that success. On that note, I'd like to introduce the sponsors. The platinum sponsor of today is Nelco, an Ecolab company. The gold sponsors are Great Lakes Solutions and Fluor. Our silver sponsors are Calgon Carbon, Fuel Tech, Navinda, and Alstom. And our bronze sponsors are Southern Research Institute, EES, ICL Industrial Products, Hitachi, Lextran, and Mitsubishi. So please visit the sponsors along with all the other exhibitors that will be around and about the outside. The lineup of speakers over the next 2 days is unquestionably fantastic, which made it a really hard job for me to know where to place everybody, but I'm hoping you're going to really enjoy that. And there's a wealth of information and industry knowledge that will be brought to you over the next 2 days. At the close of the day, there'll be a complimentary drink reception held for you, so that'll be ready for you around all of the exhibit booths, so please stay to the end and enjoy a drink with us. And so with that, I would like to hand you over to our chairman of the day, Kevin Gunn, former chairman of the Missouri Public Service Commission.
Thank you. Thanks, Eloise. Thank you, Eloise, and how about a big hand for putting this together? I really appreciate that. So thank you all for being here today. My name's Kevin Gunn, and I'm kind of your master of ceremonies. My previous title was chairman of the Missouri Public Service Commission, the state regulatory body in Missouri. I am now, as of March 1, chairman emeritus. Emeritus is person who the next guy can blame stuff on. So I'm looking forward to hearing that the next few months. I'm also from St. Louis. So it's always a pleasure to come to Chicago when the Cubs are 13.5 games behind the Cardinals. Come on. Oh, really? Come on. So anyway, I have to do that. It's Cubs-Cardinals. Come on. And they're very bad this year. So I'm very excited about the program for today and tomorrow. The power industry is experiencing incredible uncertainty and turbulence. Today, we have a federal government that's mired in continual gridlock, and so it's uncertain as to what federal energy policy looks like. I would make an argument that there actually is no coherent federal energy policy. The vacuum in federal legislative policy is being filled by federal regulatory bodies and eventually will be decided by the courts. With the executive, legislative, and judicial branches a mess, we literally have the trifecta of uncertainty going on at the federal level right now. To completely depress you, we can throw in China, India, Brazil, and other developing nations into the mix and how they're going to affect what our generation and is going to look like. Back here in the U.S., state governments and regulatory bodies are attempting to fill the gaps, but the economy, jobs, and infrastructure all seems to overshadow targeted, coherent energy policy. The other issue that leads to uncertainty is the siloed thinking of the different groups that are involved. Planners are worried about what happens decades down the road. Those that operate markets are worried about what happens in the next 5 minutes. Politicians and regulators, not surprisingly, think in terms of 4 and 6 year cycles. It's not necessarily on purpose or anything nefarious, but that's the time frame under which they're concerned about. There's no unified or integrated thought process, no unified field theory of energy policy, if you will, and that again creates uncertainty. But is there opportunity in uncertainty? The American theoretical physicist Richard Feynman said, "It is in the admission of ignorance and the admission of uncertainty that there is hope for the continuous motion of human beings in some direction that doesn't get confined, permanently blocked, as it has so many times before in various periods in the history of man." In other words, if we think everything's okay, we'll never progress. So today, we admit our ignorance. We admit that the world is full of uncertainty, and we take the opportunity to learn. Today and tomorrow, we are going to hear from an incredible array of experts in their field. While most people in the industry are playing checkers, these folks are playing chess. They are, through intellect and necessity, thinking about the second and third order consequences of the decisions that are being made. They are showing how there can be opportunity in uncertainty and how your organizations can take advantage of it. But they don't have all the answers, and that's where you come in. We're looking for a dynamic conference, one that creates discussion and debate. I want you, the audience members, to participate as much as the panelists and as much as the speakers. So I challenge you to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and above all, learn. even if you come out of here confirming the assumptions that you had walking in, you've done what Dr. Feynman has asked us to do. We have allowed ourselves to move forward and create a little less uncertainty. A couple of housekeeping items. Please, if you have cell phones, turn them on vibrate so we don't interrupt any of the presentations. Most of the speakers should have time for questions after their presentations. There are going to be a couple of wireless microphones around the room, so we ask that in order for everybody to hear, you wait until a wireless microphone gets to you, then you can identify and ask your question. For the morning session, if you don't get a question answered under some of that, we are going to have a panel discussion, and we can save some of those questions for the panel if there's not enough time to get them in. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Michael Miller is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Environment and Renewable Energy for the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI. The Electric Power Research Institute conducts research, development, and demonstration relating to the generation, delivery, and use of electricity for the benefit of the public. It's an independent nonprofit organization that brings together scientists and engineers, as well as experts from academia and the industry, to help address challenges in the electricity industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Miller.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to kind of give you kind of set the stage a little bit for this conference and talk about some of the environmental issues that all of you outside are facing. What I'm not representing today is I'm not Brian Hannigan. Brian Hannigan was supposed to give this presentation today. Those of you that know Brian, Brian is leaving EPRI. He will leave effective June 20th. Brian is going to go work for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. So if any of you have any interest in coming to the great organization called the Electric Power Research Institute to be a vice president of the Environment and Renewables portion of our research, come and give me your card. You'll be my boss. That easy. No. We'll have to go through a little bit of an interview process. So what I'm going to talk about today, in fact, I will not be embarrassed if any of you walk out of the room and say, God, here's this PRISM 2.0 presentation again. I'm going to talk about a project that we did at EPRI called PRISM 2.0, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. But if any of you have heard it, and you've heard it many times from Brian or me, because I've given this thing numerous times myself, feel free to go out and get yourself some coffee. But I think what I'm going to try to do today is at least set the stage a little bit for what we're going to be talking about later. PRISM 2.0, the PRISM project, started out as kind of a head-scratching exercise by Brian Hannigan back in about 2007, when, if you recall, a lot of legislation was going through Congress related to climate change. There were a number of the Waxman-Markey bill, remember that, the Boxer bill, all those things were happening, and there were all these proposals to reduce CO2 emissions from the electric sector to get down to 1990 emission levels by 2020, or by 90% by 2050. And so all these numbers are being tossed about, but did anyone really sit down and see whether or not the electric power sector could even reduce their emissions by that much, or we as society could reduce our emissions by that much? So Brian just did a kind of a back of the envelope. He said, well, look, let's look at what the opportunities are for CO2 reduction in the electric sector, and let's see if we can even meet those challenges if, in fact, we're pushed to the maximum. And so what he came up with was this diagram, this chart, that shows, this is the Energy Information Administration's base case for CO2 emissions. This was back in, I think, in 2008 or 2009. And he said, look, let's just assume that we are much more aggressive in terms of reducing emissions of CO2 through a program of energy efficiency. That's the blue chart. And so that would be some additional reductions you can get beyond what the Energy Information Administration is assuming in its analysis using the NEMS model. What about if we were more aggressive about renewable energy and pushed renewable energy, maybe had additional incentives the cost of wind energy, for example, was reduced dramatically? What would that do to reduce CO2 emissions, and so on? Nuclear power, coal with carbon capture and storage, plug-in electric vehicles. We take credit for that because the product that those vehicles is using, like my Chevrolet Volt, is electricity. And that would reduce net emissions from tailpipe emissions. And so that's where the PRISM came from. So people go, what's this PRISM? What's it all about? That's the genesis of the PRISM. Okay? So now when you hear PRISM, you can understand what we're talking about. So So then after we did this, we did some modeling analysis, look what the costs and implications of this might be, and that was PRISM 1.0. So I'm kind of giving you all the background. Now today I'm going to talk about PRISM 2.0 because the PRISM 1.0 was really about greenhouse gases and CO2. Then our members looked at us and said, EPRI, the issue of CO2, greenhouse gases seems to be waning in Congress. What's really whacking us right over the head is the reason we're all sitting in this room today. It's air quality issues, air emissions issues, it's water issues, it's solid waste issues. That's what's important. Can you help us get through this? You heard Kevin talk about uncertainty. Talk about uncertainty. All of you are facing it out there. What are you going to do with all these plants when you got all this barrage of environmental regulations facing you? And so what we did is we developed a model, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But first of all, Kevin talked to you about EPRI. I'm not going to say any more words about EPRI. He did a nice introduction of what EPRI is. But the only thing I will add to what he said is EPRI is a non-advocacy organization. We don't lobby. We don't push for positions. That's what Quinn Shea sitting there in the back of the room does at EEI. They advocate. He takes that information that we do, or you in this room can take the information that EPRI generates and go do your own lobbying, do your own advocacy kind of work. We do the research, do the analysis, we put it out there, we let people use it. We do not take any position. So that makes our research credible, objective, and fair. So people can argue with it and what our findings are, that's okay. Challenge us in what we do. But we're not totally non-advocacy organization. All right, PRISM 2.0. I brought you up to date on what that is. It's PRISM 2.0 it's a mathematical model of the U.S. economy, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit here in a minute. But it allows us to ask what-if questions. When you do modeling analysis and do scenarios, you can say, what if gas prices change? What about if the performance of this particular technology doesn't live up to what it should be? What if it's better? What about the cost of the technology? Its availability? Those are the kind of what-if questions you can ask. And we also did this regionally. We wanted to look at, when a lot of these times when people do analysis of all these different kinds of regulatory analyses, they look throughout the whole U.S. But the U.S. is not homogeneous, right? Things are different in Florida as they are in California, as they are in New York, as they are in the Midwest. The economies are different. The technology is different. The resource mix is different. So we wanted to have a model that really looks at the various parts of the U.S. economy. So what we did is we developed a model called U.S. Regen. It stands for the U.S. Regional Greenhouse Gas and Energy Model. It combines dispatch and capacity expansion with a high-level computable general equilibrium model of the U.S. economy. So we developed this model. We did it internally. We developed the model internally at EPRI because we felt we needed to have our own tool rather than using other people's models. Of course, when you develop a model, you got to have data to run the model. You got to have data on technology. You got to have data on the economy of these different regions. And so we at EPRI obviously develop a lot of information on control technology cost and performance, and so we can incorporate that information and other information into this model. And then we did it in two phases. We did this analysis in two phases. One was on what I'm going to talk about today, the environmental rules and regulations that you're all facing now. That's phase one, and those results are available. That report's been published. The second phase that we're working on now that I will not be able to tell you about, but I can tell you generally what we're doing. And that's when we're looking at three different scenarios on CO2. One is a CO2 tax scenario, so many dollars per ton of CO2. What would the implications of that be? The second one is on a carbon efficiency scenario. Think about it as the NSPS that EPA is rattling around about for existing units and new units, 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour kind of number. And the other one is a clean energy scenario, where you would get clean energy credits depending on your mix of generations. So you'd get higher credits for nuclear or for renewable energy that doesn't produce any CO2, some kind of partial credits for natural gas combined cycle, Zippo credit if you have coal. So those are the analyses that we're doing now. That report is in final preparation, under review. It'll be out sometime this summer or fall. All right, here are the regions that we modeled. There are 15 regions here. We picked them so they're loosely related to the NERC regions, but I call that very loosely related to the NERC regions. Also, get California, Texas, and New York as kind of their own islands, and they tend to be their own islands when it comes to energy policy, and so we broke those out separately. And you can also, we try to look at the resources. There's more wind in the Midwest, for example, so we wanted to have that as a region. And even look at the Northeast Central, we have both competitive markets and regulated markets. So we had to try to break it out that way. So this is what we did in terms of developing our tool. It's very important before I get started in showing you results, which I will do here in a moment, but what are the limitations of models? Models are approximations, they're representations of very complex systems. We are not trying to model every one of the electric power companies sitting in this room. It can't be done. We can't do it in a model like this. So you have approximation errors. We can't really look at the system dynamics like you can when you do your modeling within your companies. And of course, the data quality we get is as good as we can get, but still there's inconsistencies in data quality. It's very important that when I show you the results, if anyone stands up here and shows the results of modeling exercises, we're not trying to predict the future. We're only trying to do a number of analyses, do scenarios, ask what-if questions. You heard Kevin talk about uncertainty, trying to reduce that uncertainty, narrow that uncertainty, so you sitting in this room can make better decisions. That's the purpose of these models. And then not only that, but there are a lot of things we can't model. We can't model how policies could change at the last moment. We can't model how, when you go through doing a permit process, how that's going to may change at the last minute, how siting decisions may change at the last minute. You got to do the best you can. So again, models and the analysis I'm going to show you are just trying to get insights as to what's going on to help you narrow uncertainty. See what this guy, George Edward Pelham-Bach, said. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. We hope that the model, the regen model that we've developed is useful, but certainly it's not perfect. All right, let's get into some of the analysis. What we looked at in our study were four major, if you will, boxes of environmental rules and regulations. At the time we were doing the study, which we started in late 2010, the cross-state air pollution rule was still underway at EPA. As all of you know, that rule has been vacated. It was vacated in, I think, August of 2012. As you notice, the report came out in September of 2012. So at the time we were doing the study, we were assuming CSAPR, the cross-state air pollution rule, was going forward. Also, we wanted to model the ambient air quality standards because they affect all of you. Ambient air quality standards for SO2, for NOx, for particulate matter, for ozone. States do the state implementation plans. That has an impact on all of you too in terms of your emission reductions. Then there's that thing called MATS, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard. Major impact on everyone sitting in this room. And finally then on the water issues, the Clean Water Act 316B rules for impingement and entrainment control, and the coal combustion residuals rule. The important part about this is that you sitting in this room, you don't look at these rules individually and say, well, what am I going to do about MATS, and putting blinders on to CSAPR, putting blinders on to 316B, putting blinders on to coal combustion products rule. You say, what are all these rules going to do in total with each one of my facilities? I need to look at what are going to be the combined impacts of this. What we didn't include in this analysis were the effluent guidelines, which were just issued by EPA. That's not part of this analysis. We're trying to think maybe we should kind of overlay that on top of all this too to see what those implications are going to be. Other key assumptions, we used the Energy Information Administration's data on energy supply and growth and demand using, at that time, AEO 2011. And we assumed no specific regulations on CO2, except that we didn't allow any new coal units to be built, because that we would assume that if you are really looking forward to CO2 and you got to meet 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour, you're probably not going to build a coal plant right away. So anyway, no new coal plants. So but we didn't make any other assumptions about RGGI in the Northeast or AB 32 in California. So we ran three cases. I'm going to show you the reference case scenario. Then we ran a kind of a higher cost case and what we called a flexible case, a lower cost case. But kind of let me just give you the highlights of what we had made some of the assumptions in coming up with these numbers. And what we show here is generation in terawatt hours over time. For SO2, we assumed under this reference case that plants burning bituminous coal are going to have to use some kind of FGD system, wet or dry FGD system, lime spray dryer, or more likely a wet FGD system. For NOx, all power plants are going to have SCR. Actually go back to SO2, the emission limit that we assumed in here would be 0.15 pounds per million BTU under this scenario for SO2. For NOx, 0.1 pounds per million BTU using an SCR system. For Mercury, we assume that most plants are going to have some sort of FGD or SCR. They may have to do some trimming, some activated carbon injection, maybe some particular control upgrades for mercury control. Otherwise, if not, they'd have to put in a activated carbon system with a baghouse. For 316B rules, in this reference analysis, we assumed all plants that didn't have cooling towers would have to put in cooling towers for closed cycle cooling. And for coal combustion products, we assumed the non-hazardous waste or subtitle D regulations under RCRA. So those are the kind of the key assumptions in this analysis. And what you can see is that virtually every power plant is going to have to be retrofit. No power plants, very few power plants, hardly any power plants today have those combinations of technology on them today. So they're going to have to be retrofit. So coal-based generation is going to decline. So you see here, oops, right there, coal-based generation starting to decline after about 2015. Natural gas stays relatively flat. And that's because we assume natural gas prices in this analysis as they were in 2011. You know what happens to natural gas prices since 2011? Boom, they've gone down. I'll show you some sensitivity analysis we did with natural gas prices. No new coal, as I said, no new coal is here. That would be new coal. Nuclear, some new nuclear. This is, we allowed new nuclear after 2020, and quite a bit of an expansion of wind, of renewable energy. And this is mainly due to price declines that we anticipate for wind energy going forward. So I said we did this. This was the regionally based model. I couldn't in one slide show you 15 regions, so I'll kind of combine them. We kind of combined them here into 4 regions. But you can see, even if you combine this into 4 regions, that you see regional differences. Looking at the western and midwestern part of the United States, you see that the coal-based generation here stays relatively flat in the Midwest and the West. And that is because those are the larger, newer units that are in the West and in the Midwest, compared to the South and the East, where you see significant coal declines. Coal, I probably could do it over here on the other side, but for those of you, but you can see declines in generation in coal. That is because they're the older, smaller, less efficient units that are retiring or refueling with natural gas. So what about retirements? Under the reference case, we came up with a number that the model predicted roughly 57 gigawatts or 50,000 megawatts of coal capacity would be retired or refueled with natural gas. We don't know. Those are decisions you're making at your company, whether you could refuel or you need the capacity at those sites, whether you would retire it or maybe in some cases I've talked to people who are just going to mothball it. They're not going to make any decision. They're just going to mothball those units. So again, these are the older, smaller, less efficient units. But then you got this kind of 28 gigawatts here in the middle that are really going to be company by company decisions. Your cost recovery period for capital is going to be a very important decision process. Your region unit specific decisions. Some of these are must run units. You may not want to keep them, they're old, but you must run them for voltage control or whatever it is in the region. Changes in market prices. You may think that, you know what, over time our economy is going to improve, or because there are going to be constraints here in our market, and it's important to keep this unit, even though it may not look very economic. I expect prices to go up, and therefore it might be worth keeping this unit. So those are some of the factors that are in here. There's a lot of uncertainty. That 28 gigawatts is a lot of uncertainty. That a lot of you probably are sitting here scratching your head going, what are we going to, I'm not sure what we're going to do with these units. And the model, it's really razor edge decisions because the model makes an economic decision. But those are the ones that we looked at in our model that were really going to be difficult. But the other important part is there's still 227 gigawatts of coal capacity they're going to operate. Coal is not going away. That's still a lot of coal capacity that's still going to be operating in the U.S. So I said we ran several scenarios. We called what we called our high scenario and our flexible scenario. Think about it as inflexible and flexible. Under the high scenario, we basically said there's not going to be enough time to really look at options, lower cost options for SO2 control. For example, using dry sorbent injection. You're going to have to go with the tried and true. You're going to have to use wet scrubbers or lime spray dryers, the technology that's been around forever. You're not going to have time to go test much of anything. We also said that there's going to be some cost escalation in this high case. Think about it when there was a high demand for combustion turbines many years ago, and GE and others were saying, if you want to get higher in our list to get these turbines, we're going to have to pay a premium. Well, if the time constraints that EPA has put out are such, there may be constraints on labor and materials. Whether you, the vendors that are sitting in this room, can really supply the technology rapidly. So we looked at kind of the literature and said, let's put in a supply constraint. that would increase the cost of the technology. And given no time and very little time flexibility. So, and also in the high case that all power plants would have to have closed cycle cooling. You'd have to put a cooling tower in every plant no matter what. So that's the high case. The flexible case is just sort of the flip side of that. Now that you've got some extra time, the administration, EPA, grants the extra 2 years that you have some additional time for compliance, that you have time to test lower cost technologies, that you can to see whether or not these technologies will perform as you hope they will perform on your facility. Also, the closed cycle cooling would only be required by EPA on sensitive water bodies, such as oceans, estuaries, small rivers, tidal rivers. So only a relatively moderate portion of the capacity would require closed cycle cooling. And also, we also assume some lower cost for mercury control too. Those of you that are familiar with the Toxicon technology with smaller baghouse and carbon injection, so a lower cost for CO2. So that kind of bracketed this analysis. So now you look at it, and you look at the high case, the high cost case, the kind of less technology flexible case, and you see now what have you got? You got more units that are going to retire because you got higher costs. You also got more units that are in this middle category of what am I going to do with them? Because now your costs are higher. And of course, what you've got are less coal that would be retrofit, just because, again, higher cost, shorter time constraints. When you look at the flex case, it's different. Now you got some time. You got some time to evaluate what your options are. You've got less units that are going to retire, and certainly what's most important is you've got less units that are in this "what am I going to do with them" category. Still 5,000 megawatts. That's a lot, but it's not as much as in the other two cases. So now you've got the time. You've been able to test some of these units. You've got more time to decide what you're going to do. The costs are lower, so you can say you easier to make some decisions about whether to keep these units or retire these units. The difference in cost on a net present value basis between the high case and the flex case is $100 billion. And that's a lot of money. I'll talk to you in a minute, but on the high case, the total cost to this industry on a net present value basis is $275 billion. That's to the U.S. economy. That's a lot of money. And most of it's incurred by the electric sector. That's a lot of money. And $100 billion is a lot of money, and I don't know quite where this is all going to come down in terms of what these rules are going to finally cost all of you sitting in this room. But nevertheless, if it's $175 billion, that's still a lot of money. That is still a lot of money because it translates into cost of electricity for all of us that are consumers of your product. This just shows you in a bar chart the cost on the high case and the reference case on a net present value basis for gross domestic product. As I said, most of these costs, most of the cost of whether it's $275 billion or $175 billion is going to be borne by the electric sector. There are costs to the U.S. economy for higher costs of electricity, higher costs of natural gas, for the demand on natural gas is going to go up. So out of that $275 billion, something like $230 billion or $240 billion, I can't remember the exact number, are cost to the electric sector. The remainder is to the cost to the U.S. economy. I mentioned gas prices. When we ran this analysis, we used the prices that EIA had for natural gas. At that time, and for AEO 2011, gas prices were something like $6 or something under $6 a million BTU. Where are they today? $4-ish, $4 a million BTU, something like that. And so we decided we needed to run some sensitivity on gas prices. And so we did the kind of +2, -2, $2 a million BTU, less, or up $2 a million BTU, less $2 a million BTU. And you can also see when we were finishing the analysis too, we had the AEO 2012 numbers, which is this yellow line shown here. And I was at a conference last week in Washington, and AEO 2013 came out, and the price for natural gas are still down below, further down, lower yet. It's a curve that kind of goes down here. But even the price between 2011 and 2012 from the Energy Outlook, AEO, was about $1 a million BTU. It was significantly lower, and it was lower again for 2013. So we ran this analysis to see what are the impact of natural gas prices, because all of you sitting in the room know this has a major impact on your decision process. So when you look at it from the retirement standpoint, as you can see that if the gas prices were actually higher than when we ran the model, there would be less retirement, right? Because if natural gas prices are higher, you go, you know what, coal looks pretty good under gas prices at $8 a million. But if you get gas prices down here around $4 a million BTU, this is where you see a pretty significant drop in coal-based generation or coal capacity. And if those of you that are looking at the coal markets and the gas markets, $4 a million BTU gas versus coal prices today, that's when things are starting to reach some parity, is around that gas price. So that seemed to be, from our modeling, that's what showed up here as well. In terms of emissions, it's just wanted to show you that, see, this is for SO2 emissions going forward. There's been a significant drop in SO2 emissions. Now, this EEI tends to show these kind of charts all the time. This is extremely important because SO2 emissions and NOx emissions from the electric sector have dropped precipitously over the last 20, 25 years. And if you ask Joe and John and J&Q Public out in the street, they'll say, you'll ask them, is air quality getting better or is it getting worse? What are most of them going to say? Oh, it's getting worse. It's really bad. But look at what the electric sector has done before Casper, before the MATS rule. Down here around 3 to 4 million tons per year. After all these air rules that are going to come out, SO2 emissions are going to be down around 1 million tons per year from 14 in 1990 and even higher than that in 1970. Amazing what this industry has actually done. But the other point I wanted to make in this slide were actually 2 points. See this little bit right here? This is if you have the 2-year, if the administration EPA grant a 2-year extension, the net increase in emissions is going to be very, very small, very, very small. So people that wave up and say, "Whoa!" But if you delay a couple years, and I hate to use I'm not using the delay word. I'm saying extending the timelines. If you extend the timelines by 2 years, the net increase in emissions is going to be very, very small of SO2, extremely small. But the last point I want to make here is even at 1 million tons per year, you know what the highest emitting sector of SO2 emissions is in the country? The electric utility sector. Still is going to emit 50% of the SO2 emissions in the U.S., even at 1 million tons per year. Similar story with NOx. I don't want to belabor it, but for NOx, similar kind of thing. If you extend the timeline by a couple of years, the net increase in NOx emissions is going to be very, very small. All right, insights. The cost range that I said, somewhere between $175 to $275 billion on a net present value basis from 2010 to 2035. Is it going to be as high as 275? Probably not. That was the inflexible case, or the case that we said the high scenario case. I fully expect that EPA and the administration will allow some flexibility, so the numbers are going to tend toward the 175 rather than 275. And really this cost range is really driven by this ability to deploy lower cost technologies, the ones that you, the vendors out here, are developing to help these utilities to say, look, there are alternatives other than putting on a full-blown wet scrubber. That's very expensive on a relatively moderate size unit. There are some things that you can do that are least cost. And so we thank all of you in the vendor community that do that. The cost impacts are going to be higher, obviously, in the coal regions where coal is dominant. Gas prices are going to be extremely important, as I've mentioned several times. Retirements are going to vary substantially. I'm sure some of you are still scratching your heads about, am I going to mothball this unit? Am I going to retire this unit? Am I going to convert it to natural gas? What am I going to do with these units? Coal is going to play a significant role. Those people that say coal is going away, it's not going away. There's still going to be a significant amount of coal in this country. And if these emission reductions are phased in over an additional couple of years, there's a very modest change in terms of emissions. So, kind of summing up, there's a lot of opportunity out here for innovation. And again, I like to thank those of us that in the vendor industry that work with EPRI as well to try to come up with innovative technologies to lower cost for all of you, because lower cost of compliance means lower cost of electricity. Also, the research community, the vendor community, we're trying to help all of you sitting in this room clarify your retirement retrofit decisions. These aren't easy. These are extremely difficult. Reduce your total compliance cost and meet these desired emission rates. They're not going to be easy, and you've got to do it on a continuous basis. You're going to have continuous emission monitors for most of these things, and these are tough. Measuring PM on a continuous basis is difficult. Measuring mercury at very low concentrations, extremely difficult. But kind of the bottom line is that is this the end? Once this is over, is this the end of emission controls on power plants? I don't know. Quinn can talk about that when he gets up here. But my guess is that you got this thing called CO2 still looming out there. What are you going to do about CO2 if it comes? What are you going to do with those coal units? Carbon capture and storage, extremely expensive technology. And also, even with hazardous air pollutants, EPA has to do something called a risk analysis. A risk analysis once all the controls are on power plants. And is that sufficient? It's called a residual risk analysis. Is that going to be sufficient to do where we are today? Or are we going to have to do further on arsenic, chromium, mercury, go down the list of hazardous air pollutants? So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And if any of you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
We probably have time for one question, but if not, we can wrap up because we'll be on the panel later.
Right.
As
Yes.
A simple question. Don't need the mic. You spoke a lot about innovation and room for optimization.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you said that there is a tight time window. And if I add to that the time scale that we know we take procurement permits and so on in the United States, how all that going to fit? Where is the time for innovation to come in and help those that need to deploy emissions?
Yeah, the question is, we heard it, where's the time for innovation? It's difficult. I mean, it is really difficult to bring a new technology to market, and all of you know it, and those of you that are in the vendor community, it takes a long time. It takes a long time to do it. So the innovations really talking about here are, for example, can we use dry sorbent injection technology on units where maybe we thought we couldn't use them before? And if you're going to use Trona, or maybe something like a sodium-based sorbent, you got to think about the multimedia impacts of that. What is that going to do to my ash now that I have a soluble product? And if I'm in a net rainfall area, oops, I've got this thing called coal combustion products rule that's coming down the road from EPA. And now I've got solubilized product that I got to manage as well. What am I going to do about that? So your question is right. A two-year extension is not going to allow for truly new innovation in technology. It's not going to do it. But it is going to allow the vendor community to try some different things, to come to your plant and say, you know what, let's just see this and see if it works, rather than, you know what, you've got to comply by 2015 or 2017. You just don't have time. You know what? Frankly, we don't have time to go and do any testing of any new sorbents or any new technologies here that we've been developing at our company. And so you're going to, my best bet for you is you just go with something you know is going to work, even though it's going to cost you more. So it's a very good question. It doesn't really allow time for innovation. Okay. Thank you.
And like I said, we'll have an opportunity to ask more questions and follow up on some of this stuff in the panel discussion. All right. Well, I'm honored to introduce our next speaker. It's a homecoming of sorts for Commissioner Moeller, who's actually born here in Chicago. Commissioner Phil Moeller is currently in his second term as a Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner, sworn in on July 16, 2010, after being renominated by the President, after previously being nominated to the FERC by President George W. Bush in 2006. Prior to being on the commission, he had a variety of jobs. He headed up the Washington office of Alliant Energy. But probably even more importantly, he served as the energy policy advisor for U.S. Senator Slade Gorton from Washington, where he really worked on all aspects of energy policy, whether it be electric system reliability, efficiency, nuclear waste, but had his hand in most of the energy legislation that was passed during the time that he was there, or that was even discussed the time that we were there. He's got his BA in political science from Stanford University, and really is incredibly respected among the state regulatory community and the other regulatory community as a thoughtful and accessible commissioner. So it's my honor to introduce Phil Moeller, Commissioner from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Thank you. You'll always be Mr. Chairman to me. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I see a few familiar faces, and it's great to be back in the town I was born in. And for your sake, I'm glad that the steroid-fueled Cardinals are ahead of the Cubs right now, but the Cubs will be back, guaranteed. I was at the annual meeting of all the RTOs in North America last week, from Canada to the United States, and I'm going to borrow a quote with full attribution to Terry Boston, who heads up PJM. And his quote is, "Power engineering is not rocket science. It's much more important." And that completely summarizes my talk today, because the challenges facing you, whether you're engineers or part of utilities or vendors, is enormous at a time of absolutely unprecedented transformation of the electric system. Never before, and probably never again, will we see the kind of changes that we're enduring and experiencing and living through right now. in terms of what we've come from and where we're going. And whether we like it or not, it's a reality we need to accept and deal with because people have dealt us challenges, whether we like it or not, that we have to step up to, because if it was easy, somebody else would have done it. In my talk today, I'll talk a little bit about what FERC does and how our role has been changing, perhaps, as we relate to this incredible transformation. I'll talk a little bit about our involvement specifically in what EPA has been doing and how it affects the power sector, our roles in that. Talk a little bit about the major transformation that really we are seeing evidence of based on the results that came out last Friday night at 4 o'clock, and then speak a little bit about what I've been trying to do at our agency to lead the discussion on the convergence, frankly, of the natural gas and the electric industries. So FERC, some of you know it backwards and forwards, but I'm not going to assume that all of you know exactly what we do. We're an independent agency. So as an independent commissioner, the beauty of the model is that we are truly independent. We make our own decisions. The remarks I make today are solely my own. They don't reflect the Obama administration or the FERC itself or the chairman or the staff. And that means you can disagree with me. In fact, I welcome that, either in our brief time for Q&A after my remarks or later on when we have the panel discussion and a little bit more vibrant Q&A. But feel free to challenge anything I say. I won't take it personally, and frankly, I welcome it. But we have, I would say, I put our responsibilities into kind of 6 buckets. Some you're not going to probably care a lot about. We're the economic regulator of oil pipelines. So if you want to ship oil or you own a pipeline, we're the economic regulator. We don't cite pipelines, we don't cite Keystone unless Congress passes a law to tell us that, but a relatively small role with oil, but it's growing given our new domestic resources of oil and gas that have been discovered and exploited recently. We're the safety regulator for hydroelectric dams. So about 2,500 projects in the country. And if you want to build one, or if you already own one and you want another license, you come to us. And again, we're the safety regulators of those projects throughout the country. The third area is that we are the natural gas economic regulators for interstate pipelines, and if you want to build a new interstate pipeline, you have to come to FERC to get a certificate to build it. We've been doing a lot of that over the last few years with the growth of natural gas. Fourth, we're the economic regulators of the electric wholesale power side of the economy. So it's important to recognize, though, that we don't pick power plants. We don't say, you're going to build one, or you have to shut one down. That's really the role of the market forces or the states themselves. However, as they relate to the economics of interstate wholesale power, we're the regulator there. So the RTOs are regulated by us. Wholesale electricity is regulated by us. And that, frankly, takes up most of the time at FERC is wholesale electric regulation. The 2 areas that Congress gave us in 2005 were new areas. The first major enforcement authority that we lacked prior to 2005. We can now fine entities up to $1 million per day per violation. That was somewhat coming out of the 2000-2001 West Coast crisis, where FERC lacked a lot of enforcement authority. Some people in Congress thought if we had more, we could perhaps use it as a mechanism to deter bad behavior, but that takes up now a lot of our time as an enforcement agency of certain rules that we adopt. But the 6th area that's most relevant to the discussion today is that we're essentially in charge of the reliability of the bulk power system. We delegate most of that responsibility to NERC as the Electric Reliability Organization. But it was a brand new set of authority. We as a nation went from a set of voluntary standards that had been in place for roughly 30 years to mandatory standards in 2005. The growing pains have been evident probably to all of you. I think we're starting to sort it out. But it is a pretty big sea change to go from voluntary standards to mandatory standards with penalties and enforcement in an industry as important as the electric sector. And so as a commissioner, the role that I take in reliability is that I'm frankly fuel neutral. There are there are certain certain fuels that I'm more familiar with. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest after moving from Chicago, so I'm very comfortable with hydropower. And I see the advantages and the disadvantages of each of the fuels. But it's not my role to pick fuels, so I'm fuel neutral, but I'm not reliability neutral. Because if there is a major disruption, if we had something occur similar to what happened in 2003, I'm going to be called up in front of Congress and raising my hand and testifying to the effect of what did we do or not do related to that. And that's where this issue has particularly inspired my interest and motivation because of the wide-ranging nature of it and how it affects not only what you do, but the entire industry and essentially just about every consumer in the United States. So moving to a little bit of the history, the EPRI perspective was terrific. Dr. Hannigan, I'll have to send him a note. He and I used to work in the U.S. Senate together, but the PRISM perspective of the presentation I've always found useful. It shows the degree of challenge in front of us. So a few years ago, EPA put out their suite of rules, or either they had released them or they were talking about it. And the ones that concerned me the most, again from a reliability perspective, were MATS and CASPR. And it seemed like the industry was almost shell-shocked when you go through the range of other rules that could be affecting primarily coal, not exclusively, but primarily 316B with the water intake, coal ash and residuals, the possibility of CO2, regional haze, which is very important in some areas. The industry was kind of back on its heels saying, you know, how do we react? What do we do? And so my motivation being in this industry my entire career is that these are pretty aggressive rules. And it's not that the industry can't do it, but the time frame is significant, not only in terms of meeting standards, but the impacts on consumers and their pocketbooks, because like any type of construction job, whether it's your kitchen or retrofitting a coal plant, the more you rush it, the more it costs consumers and the harder it is to do. And there's a strange kind of contradiction that's come out of all of this. I think for the most part, EPA, who I generally get along with pretty well. I'm sorry that Gina McCarthy couldn't be here, but there are obvious reasons why she can't. And there was one period last year, in a 2-week period, we testified together in front of Congress, had different takes on this issue perhaps, testified in front of the National Governors Association, and then we had some other public meeting. We were on the same forum, and she turned to me at one point and said, "Phil, you ignorant slut." Of course, out of, I think, a mutual respect, but we'd been together so much that we were starting to sound like the Saturday night routine of Jane Curtin and the other Saturday Night Live actor who would mock, of course, the 60 Minutes every week. So nevertheless, we've had an open relationship. We disagree on certain things. But my concern is that EPA is not full of power engineers. They are environmental engineers, and they're, I'm sure, quite dedicated. But to understand the enormous transition that this industry is going to go through in a squeezed timeline, it just didn't add up to me in terms of, frankly, keeping the lights and, more importantly, the air conditioners on for the consumers of this country. So EPA, in retrospect, I think got really, really, really lucky on a couple things. The D.C. Circuit stayed the CASPR rule. And you know, that probably, I'm a Republican, but that probably saved the president's job, because if CASPR hadn't been stayed, we would have had a real mess last summer, particularly in some of the states like Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma. But that being stayed was very fortunate for EPA, and of course, the incredible domestic resource of shale gas that we've essentially been able to exploit through hydrofracking and horizontal drilling in the last 5 years has allowed for a price-sensitive fuel to essentially take over where coal is being phased out in those areas. And in that sense, EPA got extremely lucky as well. And then the conundrum, the kind of interesting challenge I think that all of us have related to the MATS rule is that when it was initially proposed, it was going to be incredibly costly and challenging for this industry to absorb. And I think most of you probably, and certainly I was out there saying, this is going to be an amazing challenge. Don't think it can be done in the time frame. It's going to be incredibly costly. And in one sense, the process worked because EPA backed off. And now that there are many fewer bag houses required, it's going to be possible that the industry can actually pull this off in a pretty tight time frame. It's still going to be $175 billion or whatever. It's still, still a major impact. Some of you will benefit from that money. I realize that. But still, consumers will see that. And the challenge is that some of us who came out there with the alarms, it wasn't very well known to policymakers that EPA backed off as much as they did. So we can sometimes look like we said the sky was falling, when in reality, because of EPA's willingness to examine the data, back off, we're all in a much better situation. But for those who don't necessarily follow the issue daily, it kind of looks like perhaps we were crying wolf, but we weren't. The reality is those very real concerns about the costs and the timelines were valid and were hopefully reflected in the final rule. Nevertheless, the challenge is enormous. The timelines were talked about earlier, but MATS comes into effect in less than 2 years. Most states seem to be willing to give the extra year, the 4th year, to those entities that request it, because EPA has been very good about delegating that to states. But the 5th year, the one that has to go through a particular process through EPA, FERC now will have a role in advising EPA on the 5th year. To me, the 5th year is still a fantasy, because based on prior experience, particularly those cases in San Francisco and Arlington, Virginia, those entities that were given the waiver to run by the federal government because their power was needed for public health and safety still faced civil lawsuits for violating those environmental rules. And they've essentially said, we're not going to do it again, or at least we certainly don't want to be in that position. Hence, there is legislation on the Hill that I've testified in favor of that would clarify that if an entity requests the 5th year or in some situations is asked to run in violation of certain air rules, that they are essentially given a pass on enforcement of civil lawsuits or other type of penalties that could be imposed on them if they're being asked to run. But given that uncertainty that still exists out there until, in my opinion, the federal legislation is passed, the 5th year is a fantasy, which means the 4th year is all you get, and that's less than 3 years away. An enormous challenge in front of the utilities, that particularly coal-heavy utilities that are doing what you're doing or what you're helping them do in again, a relatively, I think, a very tight time frame. Throughout the process, I've been asking EPA to be more flexible with timing because, again, as referenced earlier, this can be done, but with another year or two, the flexibility will be there to make it more manageable. Perhaps newer technologies will be developed in the meantime, and certainly the cost pressures will be less if there isn't quite the rush for actual physical materials, skilled labor, engineering expertise down the line. So we have still an interesting challenge ahead of us. I've been surveying some of the major utilities that we regulate to see how they have been dealing with this over the last few months, now that some assumptions have changed and they're going forward. I would generally summarize those discussions as, we think we can make it if everything goes right. But if one thing goes wrong, we don't get the transmission upgrades we need, if we have any disruption in the supply chain or the labor supply chain, or something other unexpected, we might be in a very challenging position related to a specific load pocket. Of course, not calling out any utility specifically, but I think we've been worried about Northern Ohio for the last couple of years, given the challenges and again, the enormous transition that's going on there. There are other load pockets as well. I'll be watching them and, nervously hoping that we can get by. And I think to EPA's credit, they've learned a lot about the electric industry that they didn't know 3 years ago. We've urged them to get out there and talk to not only utilities themselves, but to get to know the regional markets specifically, the people who run them, how they are run, get to know more about load pockets specifically, and the fact that these will be very localized challenges. You may recall that some of their initial analysis estimated that we'd lose something like 11 gigawatts to the MATS rule, which was pretty laughable because we shot past the 11 gigawatts threshold about a week after the rule was announced. I mean, what are we up to now? About 70? So their credibility was a little bit challenged in some of those initial numbers. And then they came out with kind of regional impact numbers that, the Midwest will be affected this way, the Northeast, the South. But the point wasn't aggregating regional numbers. The point was load pockets. That's where the challenges are going to come in. And I think to their credit, they've learned a lot more about that, but I would advise you, don't assume that regardless of the perspective you're coming from in this, don't assume that they know what you know. Make sure that your companies or you specifically are communicating with the regional offices of EPA, if appropriate, the national office of EPA, so that they recognize the precise challenges that you will be going through to meet, again, what I would consider a very aggressive timeline to try and meet the standards that they've put out. Speaking of transition, if you haven't been paying that close attention, perhaps it's not in your role or your set of responsibilities, but the PJM capacity auction results for the 3-year forward market came out on Friday at 4. And they were pretty stunning. The numbers are showing quite a drop in capacity prices throughout the PJM footprint. Even some of the specific zones that separate and higher prices are still much lower than last year. Significant imports into PJM from MISO and from other areas. And it was kind of, I think, a big wet blanket on a lot of the generators because of what it shows, just the amazing transitional nature of what we're going through. Lower prices. You've heard the predictions of either flat or perhaps even reduced load growth over the next few years in the country. And if you break down the capacity numbers from that auction, the assumption is basically gas at about 515 or 525 I've seen. So an assumption that going out, we've still got pretty moderate gas prices, at least 3 years, perhaps longer. And it's a cold reality to a lot of the coal fleet that's kind of what we're dealing with. And yet, also as Michael referenced earlier, coal's not going away. It's still going to be somewhere between 38 and probably 45% of our total generation going forward. It's not all bad news for the coal industry, but the numbers are particularly when you look at PJM and you contrast it to, say, the summer of 2008, to think where we'll be in 3 years, and that we would have, as the nation's largest market, move that much coal out of the mix and move that much gas in. This is unprecedented. It's absolutely amazing. In one sense, it's a testament to the power engineering sector, but it's also fundamentally changing the way we have to look at the entire power sector. And so for the last about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, I've been increasingly concerned that at the FERC we weren't paying enough attention to this major transition. Because when you move from a fuel supply that can be stored in a 30 or a 60 or a 90-day pile, as coal can, to one where you are dependent perhaps on one, if you're lucky, maybe more than one pipeline in just-in-time fuel delivery, that's a pretty big change from a reliability perspective. And you add to that the fact that these are industries where they are financed differently. You have of course bilateral markets, and you have organized competitive markets at the wholesale level throughout the country on the electric side. But for the most part, the gas industry is premised on the fact that LDC load in the wintertime pays for pipes long term. And now you've got essentially a new customer coming in that has a very different load profile. And for those of you who deal with gas plants, you know they can take an enormous amount of gas off the pipeline in a very short amount of time, not really what the system was designed for. The generators themselves, unless they're base load, may not know until the day ahead whether they're going to be called and when they're going to be called, and added uncertainty into the operation of our electric system. And I was motivated for several reasons. I mean, I think generally speaking, gas has been easier to build than on a base load for the last 10, 15 years. I think most people would recognize that. With the growth of renewables, particularly wind and now solar, the fact is they are intermittent, and they need to be backed up with ramping of usually fast-turning gas plants. That's going to be incredibly exacerbated out in the California market if you've seen the duck or the elephant graph that they're looking at in 2020. Just enormous ramping necessary late in the day going forward. Again, that's going to be met with gas. I'm a big proponent of electric transmission, and oftentimes transmission is a better alternative than generation, but it is so hard to build electric transmission in this country that oftentimes it's just easier to plop a gas plant down. And then, of course, the suite of EPA rules that we've talked about this morning and we'll talk about over the next couple days, also putting pressure on essentially gas replacing a lot of the coal fleet. And finally, the price that we've seen over the last few years because of this abundant supply of gas also leads us to the fact we're just plain going to be using more gas to make electricity in this country. I sat for a couple of years on the National Petroleum Council study that projected out North American oil and gas resources to 2030 with a soft estimate out to 2050. The report was put out about a year and a half ago. It's still a good read, but to me, not necessarily as a regulator and as an economic regulator being exposed to the downstream people as much. I had a chance over a couple of years to get to know these people and to see how the industry was evolving really right before our eyes, and the fact that they were changing fracking techniques almost from month to month and getting it a little more precise, figuring out their fluids. And the takeaway from this report is that we just have an enormous amount of gas in North America. Now, we may as a society, I'm not advocating for this, we may as a society to decide to restrict access to some of those resources, either through regulating fracking or putting lands off limits. But technology will only allow us to find more. And of course, prices can be affected by our export policy, by the lack of infrastructure. But in reality, we're probably going to have gas, and a lot of gas, for a long time. It's something we need to recognize. And from a reliability perspective, we need to be much more engaged, regardless of what our role is, in the fact that these industries are converging. And I kind of kick-started an effort at FERC where I wrote a letter to the world with a number of questions saying, how should we deal with these challenges short-term, specifically with mostly weather-related events in the winter where there might not be enough gas to go around, medium-term, the right economic signals, perhaps syncing up the trading days, long-term, assuring that we have adequate pipeline supply to fuel, frankly, these new demands for gas. And that has evolved into an official FERC effort with a docket number. We've held 6 technical conferences. We have more to come. I'm hoping this summer we'll come up with some guidelines that will affect both the electric and the gas side going forward, particularly with an emphasis on next winter so that entities can communicate. But it's incumbent on all of us, whether we come from an electric background or a gas background, to get to know the other side a lot better, because the convergence is real and the operational challenges are real. And most people have grown up in one or the other. Most have either grown up electric or gas. A few people have had exposure to both. But again, they are physically different systems in terms of how fast the energy is delivered. They are financed differently. They are regulated somewhat differently. And in some cases, they basically use different languages. Some cases, the same words means a very different thing to the gas side or the electric side. And so I urge you, given that this is mostly an electric crowd, to get to know the gas industry better. There's one way to do it. We put out a report, a FERC-NERC joint report, put out in August 2011, that talked about the outages in the Southwest. Remember around the Super Bowl, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. It was weather-driven, but the fact is that outages on the gas side affected the ability to deliver electricity, and outages on the electric side affected the ability to move gas. And the report is a good report. It's focused on that region, but it has a good primer on both the electric industry and the gas industry if you're looking for a place to go. So the challenges are real and in front of us, and for those of you who have to do the hard work to get through the next few years, I commend you. You can at least know that this commissioner is watching very closely with an eye toward maintaining reliability, hopefully keeping costs down as well, knowing that there are enormous challenges in front of us. I'll be here for the morning. One of my attorney advisors, who's a native of Chicago, he was born here, he went to high school here, he went to the University of Chicago and the University of Chicago Law School. Robert Ivanakis is in the corner. He'll be here the entire 2 days if you have criticisms, comments, other thoughts that you want to pass on to him. I appreciate your attention, the hard work. We're all in this together, a time of enormous transition. But again, if it was easy, somebody else would have done it. Mr. Chairman?
I think we can do the same thing where we have time for one more question and then we can follow up on the panel. So are there any immediate questions for right now?
Let me applaud you for addressing the issue of reliability as far as natural gas supply for power plants. I encourage you to think about the potential of going one step further in terms of natural disasters, because a number of these major pipelines run through areas that have historically, particularly looking at the Midwest, historically had significant ruptures of service. On the electric side, for our coal plants, we're spending an enormous amount of time and energy and manpower dealing with very tiny issues related to cybersecurity and physical security. We don't worry about the coal pile very much, but we're pushing the whole industry to go to natural gas, and natural gas, if you look at the whole picture, is just not that reliable under certain conditions.
I hear you. Of course, your gas brethren would vehemently disagree, but the reality is it's a just-in-time fuel supply. And of course, we can have coal plants trip off too, but from that perspective, you're right. Particularly, I think the Midwest Independent, Mid-Continent, MISO, is spending a lot of time, and I commend them. They've really gotten on this in a hurry, but they have a long way to go still, figuring out the pipeline infrastructure in the Midwest, those plants that are dependent on one pipe, those plants that might have to take a heavier load as other plants are retrofitted during the shoulder season, Some are repowered, some are shut down. You add on to this the fact that pipeline safety regulations are being developed by PHMSA out of the Department of Transportation that will take some of these pipes out of service for several weeks. And we've been hoping, trying to work with them to make sure they recognize that this is a period of enormous transition. If you take a pipe out, you could be taking part of the electric system out. Be thinking of this before you shut a pipe down for a few weeks. There's a big push in New England to try and encourage dual fuel to get kind of a backup, but the economics of that are challenging when it's costly to have an inventory supply of fuel oil that may or may not be fully compensated in a competitive market. So your point is well taken. It's a contingency that we have to factor in from a reliability perspective. And we've been working with our state colleagues at NARUC. 3 times a year we bring these issues up. I just want to make sure that my state colleagues are fully aware of the consequences here. And, there are upsides, there are downsides, but we have to go in with our eyes wide open to make sure we know what we're doing here and either physically or economically have policies that minimize reliability risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, and I think that's the demonstration of what I taught today is these folks are playing chess, and in some ways it's three-dimensional chess in 2 rooms at one time, when trying to do everything. So we have a couple of changes to the itinerary. Just I want to let everybody know, because we had a speaker drop out of the morning session, and we have a couple speakers that wanted to take a little bit more time. The next session is going to go about 15 minutes longer, and that's going to push everything back. And then we'll take the break at about 10:45, and then start the panel about 11:20. So by the time we get through that, we'll be caught up in the afternoon, so everything else will be on the schedule. Our next speaker is Dr. Bruce Keiser. Dr. Keiser is a research associate employed by Nelco with the responsibility for research and development in air protection technology and nanotechnologies. His work has focused on efficient clean power generation as well as new uses for oil and water in industrial processes. He has his doctorate in inorganic chemistry from the University of Wyoming, and recently his work has been in developing and implementing mercury control solutions for coal-fired power plants, so much of what we've talked about today, and specifically concentrating on solutions to improve the mercury capture efficiency of wet flue gas desulfurization units at our nation's power plants. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Keiser.
Thanks, Kevin. Sure. Oh, I think so. I hope so. Thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. I was standing in the back of the room, and I realized I was now the first researcher to give a presentation in this meeting today. So I have a lot of responsibility in terms of leading the way in that regard. I also noticed that I wasn't really sure whether it was the announcement that we were going 15 minutes longer in this session, or whether the announcement was that we had a researcher speaking next, that everybody kind of got up and kind of left. So I'm going to take it from the standpoint that everybody wanted a break a little bit earlier rather than a reflection on my area of expertise. Last night I was preparing for this presentation, and I was reminded of what's going on in this industry, and I kind of want to share that with you this morning. I live in Plainfield, which is not far from here. And we had a storm come through last night. Tornado warnings went up. I've been fighting a battle with my roof. And so as the winds picked up and the rain started to fall, I ran around trying to figure out where was the next leak of water going to penetrate my house. And I realized in that moment that it's a lot like what we're going to be going through in 2015. We know the storm is coming. We know that there are things that we have to do to prepare for it. We will prepare for it. We will help you do that as a supplier to the industry. Our intention is to ensure reliability to all of our customers and for our supply of electricity, and mine particularly during a storm. But there's going to be emergencies. There's going to be opportunities for us during that period as we learn these new technologies and these new innovations that we have to take advantage of. We don't have the option any longer to say we're not going to pick up this technology, we're not going to solve this issue, this problem, we're not going to remove mercury from the flue gas. We don't have that option any longer. We now need to take action, and we're going to provide you with reliable solutions to do that. My intention today, quite frankly, is to provide some background information to allow you to begin to understand that, to provide you with some information on some potential solutions, and to look at these solutions in reference to what you may be familiar with already as you look at potential solutions to this problem, to removing your mercury going forward. I'm not going to be reading the slides to you. I hope not anyway. They're here so that you can read them, and so we'll just move on from there. Controlling mercury emissions begins with 2 steps, and you need to, I'm sure that by now we're deep into this, trying to figure out your strategy for controlling mercury. You understand now that there are 2 aspects to this process. You first have to control speciation or manage speciation of the mercury in your flue gas. The second thing you have to do is capture it. So when it comes to managing first your speciation, you've seen this, it's been reported by EPRI, it's been reported by EPA, it's been reported by just about everybody across the industry. It begins with understanding your fuel source. The fuel source, or more specifically your halogen content in that fuel source, does begin to dictate to you what the speciation is and how efficient your unit will be in capturing total mercury. There are many components in your flue gas. You can see those there, but specifically what you're trying to do and what we've seen is higher halogen, higher speciation, better capture, better probability to meet the regulations. This is a graph that was put together not by us. You can see the reference at the bottom. It was prepared by Sergeant Lundy. There's 2 things that I want to point out about this graph. This is specifically bituminous coal, obviously because it has chlorine content across the x-axis. And it also has this particular unit. This graph was put together for units with SCRs, catalysts, to control NOx. What you'll notice that, and I'll try to go this way. I'm sorry, I'm right-handed, so I go left-handed. I guess that's the way it is. What you'll notice that there are several curves on this graph. They're theoretical. You're going to be in different positions depending on your unit. But the real key here is that as you increase the chlorine content of your coal, you increase your speciation or your oxidation. Increasing your oxidation gives you a higher probability of meeting your regulations, capturing that mercury. But more specifically, if you look at the blue line, it tells you that as the SCR catalyst changes, as your unit operation changes, the speciation will change. As that speciation changes, so will your capture and the probability of your meeting regulations. I think one of the most important things that we have to understand here today is as we're moving forward, and I've been beginning to see this more and more, is that your units are no longer base loaded. They're becoming more peakers. They're varying their load. And so as a consequence, when we go in to run a test, if you run a test at the best condition, meaning a new SCR catalyst, high load, you've been running that for a long period of time, you can get really good capture. But what happens when you begin to vary your load? What happens when you ask your operators now to control mercury emissions, control your HAPS emissions, while they're controlling the load or running your unit? And that's where we have to get to. We have to understand that. We have to provide solutions that do not only solve your problem at peak load, but are easily managed across load variation, day-to-day swings. This, unfortunately, is the graph put together for a PRB or a subbituminous coal plant. You can see here they're talking about on the lower axis, the x-axis, percent elemental oxidation. The point of this is, even with an SCR, okay, and a wet scrubber, your probability of meeting mercury capture is very low. You can only get, according to this, a maximum of about 40% mercury capture. Why? Again, it's all about controlling mercury speciation. If you control mercury speciation, you maximize that so that you have the potential of meeting regulations. The next step is you got to capture it. You got to put it somewhere. With existing air quality control devices such as a wet FGD, it's relatively simple to do because a lot of these types of scrubbers have been installed in the industry. They are wet-based. The nice thing about oxidized mercury is it's soluble in water. So you have an opportunity to capture it at an existing air quality control device, something that you're running currently already. There are many different types. There's many different chemistries. Point of matter, we've looked at these. We understand the variations among these different chemistries and operations, and we've provided a solution that works in all of these, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The real question that came up at the beginning of all of this, as we looked at wet scrubbers, was if you look at the chemistries across here, and I apologize if this is too small, but you can see that we're looking at, get my finger out of the way, we're looking at very different chemistries, and we're looking at very different rates of removal across those wet scrubbers. There's a lot of potential here for improving efficiencies when some of them are already reaching over 90, 95%. And the question becomes, why is there a range from 50 to 80% capture of mercury across a wet scrubber? It comes down to two answers. The first is mechanical, which is something that we can't do anything about, but you certainly can. Mechanical comes in to are the types of things like, what is the pH that you're running your scrubber at? How often do you do blowdown? What is the chemistry of your scrubber in terms of at equilibrium? And what's it going to be? The most important question that you need to ask is, what's your chemistry in your scrubber going to look like after 2015? Because it's not going to be the same. The storm has gone through, and we're going to be running at a different baseline condition. The second thing, which is the chemistry within that scrubber, also impacts the efficiency of your wet scrubber for capturing mercury. And that relates to something called re-emission. I've shown it here, and very simply put, the easiest way you can tell whether or not you have emissions, measure the elemental mercury before the scrubber, measure the elemental mercury at the stack. If the elemental mercury at the stack is higher than the elemental mercury before the scrubber or before or coming out of the boiler, if it's higher, if the elemental mercury is higher, then you have re-emissions. I've shown a very complicated graph here, and I want to really emphasize all of this is kind of interesting. Most of it you know about. Researchers always put more information on a slide than you need to know. So that's how you can tell this is a research presentation. But if you look right here, okay, I'm sorry. If you look right here at the lower right-hand corner where it says percent reemission, you can see the red line is the inlet elemental mercury. The green line, dashed line, is the stack elemental mercury, and that difference is reemission because the stack number is higher. That's what you're looking for, very simply put. How does reemission impact your ability to meet, or that unit's ability to meet mercury regulations? Again, this is not a slide that we put together. This is a graph that I borrowed from Sargent and Lundy, but it clearly shows across the x-axis how increasing reemission as a percent of mercury coming in impacts your total removal. And you can see that it decreases relatively quickly. If you have 15 to 20% reemission, you're already below 90% capture, which means you're not going to be able to comply with mercury regulations. Now, some people have been telling you, or have been trying to tell you recently, that this is about controlling elemental mercury, that there is no such thing as reemission, and it's not an issue. I can tell you right now, if you look at this slide at the right-hand side, it's all about oxidized mercury. Oxidized mercury is 4.8 grams per liter soluble. Elemental mercury is only 0.027 grams per liter. Now, certainly in a million-gallon reactor, you're going to have a lot of opportunity for elemental mercury. But the point of the matter is, you've got 180 times more probability of capturing ionic mercury. And the idea is, get it in the ionic form, capture it in the ionic form, keep it in the ionic form, and get it out of your scrubber. That's the story in a nutshell. Higher reemission, higher stack emissions. Nelco technology is shown here. We've kind of summarized this. We go from coal pile to water emissions and across the unit. The key here is that it's about managing the overall unit operation. We heard a little bit earlier that you cannot come up with a solution, you cannot utilize a solution if you're not looking at water discharge concerns downstream, your ash concerns downstream, and that's exactly what we talk about. We're about managing mercury emissions across the unit operation without impacting your operation, without impacting the quality of your ash, without impacting the quality of your byproducts or your water. Control speciation, capture it using existing air quality control devices, including potentially dry scrubbers, dry and semi-dry scrubber. And do it based on innovative approaches. This is I've chosen a subbituminous coal case because, as we talked about previously, it is the hardest to get to. These types of units have the lowest mercury speciation, so you have to first control speciation. This particular unit, if you look at the diagram, does not have an SCR. So already, not only does it have low chlorine content, it's also fighting an uphill battle because it has no SCR. If you use a boiler additive, such as the 7895, this is intended to get you your speciation coming out of the boiler. It's low cost, it's simple to apply, low capital. I'll give you three things to think about in terms of divining a solution to mercury. Okay? The solution can be a permanent solution, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Also consider this as a temporary solution. We've heard continuously about the manpower concerns, construction, how are we going to get ready in such a short period of time? These solutions are intended to make your existing air quality control devices compliant now. Okay? You can be compliant to meet the regulations that are coming. If you want to look at, we will be continuing to develop new innovations going down the road. This allows you then the time, once you've established your compliance on these units, to go out and test our next innovation to control mercury and HAPs. So it buys you the time. So that's the second thing that you should think of, and then it provides you the opportunity to continue to develop and add on as you need to ensure the continual operation of those units. Back to speciation control. This is on the green is the baseline. You can see, as expected, very low oxidation, about 20%. You add a small amount of boiler additive, about 100 parts per million, and you get right up into the 90%. And you can see the averages on the right-hand side in the table with the standard deviations during the period of the demonstration. Again, the idea here is maximize your speciation. If you have a wet scrubber, the next step is use that air quality control device, get the co-benefits. You're going to be operating it anyway. Let's use it to capture mercury, but let's improve the efficiency to over 100%. Using this technology, using a scrubber additive, you can improve that efficiency to nearly to over 90%. It's simple. It's a simple application and simple to maintain. What I'm showing here on the left is the feed system. What I do not show you in this presentation is the control module that we have developed. This control module is simple and easy to install. It can be installed as a temporary system during the demonstration. It controls the feed rate, responds to changes in load, responds to the changes in the boiler chemistry on a real basis. So as your load changes, as your operation changes on your unit, it makes the correction to minimize the use of additives while maintaining assurances that you are compliant and increasing your efficiencies. This is a diagram, diagram of the results of this demonstration. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I think, quite frankly, I do a graph because it's, for me, I'm a picture person. You can see the blue. Well, it actually looks kind of purple here, right? Is the re-emissions aspect. So as the mercury re-emission goes down, the green, which is the capture, goes up. Okay? And you can see we can get this capture rate above 80% to make it compliant. You can see how quickly the control takes place, how you can maintain it, and how it recovers in the absence of control. We do this to show the response to the activity of the product. But let's be honest. If this is your unit right now, this is where your unit's going to be after 2015. We don't want to go back here at any point after 2015. So you can see that the efficiency for your wet scrubber for capturing ionic mercury in this particular test at baseline was 80%. We improved the efficiency to 100% in this particular example. And that's where you need to be. Utilize your existing air quality control devices to do what you need them to do, as a co-benefit as well as the major benefit. So it allows you to reduce your re-emissions, increases your efficiency, and it brings your capture rate up to the level of your speciation. You have to get your speciation up above 75%. I'd like to talk for a few minutes. The question, again, we were talking about the effect on operations within scrubber units. This is balance of plant. the solids that are developed as a consequence, and the question always comes up, where does the mercury go? Mercury goes into the scrubber. From the scrubber, we transfer it to the solids. From the solids, it goes out of your scrubber and out of your system. That's where you want it, out of your unit operations. The solids that are produced past the T-clip, there's no effect on SO2 capture, there's no effect downstream, and frankly, there's no effect that the operators see whatsoever. Operators continue to maintain their unit operations without any change. The gypsum quality remains unaffected as well. I want to talk a little bit about, I've been talking about this as we go, the effective use of air quality control devices. There's a lot of different ways to capture mercury, a lot of different ways, particularly with the utilization of a unit that has, has a wet FGD. A lot of people today are looking at and evaluating the use of absorbents or sorbents up front of a wet scrubber as a means to capture mercury. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that doesn't work. I am going to tell you that what we haven't seen, or what you will probably not see during a demonstration, is the downside of that strategy. The downside of that strategy is that eventually the idea is you will capture mercury ahead of the scrubber, but none of those applications captures 100% of the mercury, none of them. In point of fact, I'd be surprised if you would want to feed enough sorbent to capture 100% mercury. You're really going to end up capturing just enough to meet your mats with some insurance, which is exactly what you should be doing. What happens to the rest of that mercury, though? Where does the rest of that mercury go? And you're looking at stack. You're not looking at post-sorbent injection mercury levels. So your scrubber is still doing work, which means down the road, you're going to see a spike in your stack mercury sims because you're going to have a re-emission event. It's not going to be consistent. It's going to be random. Well, not random. It's going to be based on your load history. It's going to depend on how you cycle your scrubber. But all of a sudden, down the road, you're going to be injecting carbon or you're going to be injecting a sorbent. You're going to raise your hand in the back, and I've already had this happen at a presentation. I've been injecting carbon, and I see this huge emission. I go from compliant, 1.2 pounds per trillion, up to 13 pounds per trillion, and it lasts for a day or two. What's causing that? It's being caused by the fact that you are not managing your wet scrubber as well for your mercury. So why inject a sorbent? It's a good question, because you can do it all with your wet scrubber. This is an example of some work that was done recently by us at a site. They were injecting powder activated carbon ahead of the scrubber. They were having trouble meeting their max limit. Their question to us was, do you think re-emission creates an issue for us? So we began to inject scrubber additive, but the customer was reluctant to turn off their pack until we had demonstrated that indeed we had reduced stack emissions below mats. We then convinced them to turn off the pack, and lo and behold, we maintained, as you can see here on the far right, compliance to mats limitations. This is the importance of understanding the strategy of using existing air quality control devices as the best available means to capture mercury. If you improve those efficiencies, you don't need to add other things. You can reduce your costs. And that's, as we've heard earlier today, what we're about: reliability, lower cost. We also heard about the need to continue to innovate. and that's exactly what we've done. I want to introduce a new product here. I'm not going to make a whole lot of, I'm not going to be taking a lot of time on this. It is a new scrubber additive that we're introducing called 8034 Plus. The key here is that it provides the following benefits. We've improved the toxicity, we've lowered it. It's now considered, according to EPA definitions, and it's kind of, I laugh a little bit when I read this, practically non-toxic. That's almost, I think that's the same listing as you would have for water. It's practically non-toxic. When I was dealing with my water in my kitchen last night, I didn't consider water as a non-toxic, but it's patented technology. It's been shown performance. It does not add chlorine, so other additives to your scrubber prevents that, and has improved shelf life. And it has been, we have already tested it, and it does perform, excuse me, it does perform very well in this particular application. That's all I'm going to say about it. But it's a next generation innovation that will help you meet your MATS limits. One of the things that is always of an interest, and when I started in this industry, I was amazed by, quite frankly, the first unit that I went by and came across a 2205 alloy-based scrubber, and I was amazed to walk past it and see the Swiss cheese effect. I come from a company, quite frankly, that deals with corrosion, that I have seen it in the laboratory. I have seen boiler tubes and other constructed items that have corrosion, both general and pitting, localized. And I was appalled to see the first unit scrubber that I walked past that, quite frankly, was leaking faster than they could repair it. And it was eye-opening for me. And so I was interested when we started to do some of the testing. One of the benefits of this technology, as we did we actually, because of our controller, because of our technology, our temporary controller monitor that we use on these units, we can actually also monitor corrosion rates real time. And so we get a measure for how your operations and our application of scrubber additives can impact the long-term life of your scrubber. And we've done this now in two different configurations, looking at 2205. This is in fact 2205 alloy, as you can see here on the upper left-hand corner. The higher the graph, the worse it is. The lower the graph, the better it is. So you can see here baseline. I'm showing here just general corrosion. So you can see here before the start of the demonstration, very high general corrosion. During the demonstration, it was well under control. We stopped application of the scrubber additive, and corrosion returned at a very high rate. Interestingly enough, the same thing is true for pitting or localized corrosion, and here you can see the same thing. This is the green line, again, is localized corrosion. You can see during the demonstration period, the application of the scrubber additive, very low localized corrosion, and when we stop the addition, a very high corrosion rate. We understand what's happening here on 2205. We now understand how to control this particular phenomenon, and quite frankly, this is real. We've also done this study in terms of 317L and seen very similar results. So it appears to be, and yes, we are still doing more work, and as we always do, okay, as every good researcher does. I'm not really satisfied with one method of measurement. And we're backing this up with more and more data as we generate it with various demonstrations. So if you're interested, we're interested in helping you look at this as well. I also promised you that we look at, from the beginning to the end, if we're transferring the mercury from the flue gas using a wet scrubber, it's got to go into the water. Where does it go from there? The concern is with lowering limits on your water discharge that are just around the corner. In fact, Nelco is working with the EPA to figure out what kind of test protocols, what those limits should be, what technologies are going to be available to you to help meet those discharge limits. We're interested in making sure that our customers are also compliant to water discharge issues. And that's where these two products come in. Very simple products to apply. They specifically target mercury, but also other heavy metals. What we've seen, and I'm not going to cover this in detail today, but what we've seen is as we make these additions, we also control the form of selenium and improve the removal of selenium as a contaminant from your water discharge as well. But specifically what we're looking at here are cations, mercury, and heavy metals. And what I'm showing here is some results recently that we had for a unit. We looked at the water discharge. Their limit was set at 200 parts per trillion. And you can see as we increased the capture rate across the x-axis from the existing 65% capture to a high of 95% mercury capture, we were able to maintain a discharge level very comfortably below 200 parts per trillion. In fact, as we continue to combine these additives, we find that we actually improve even further. So it's a synergistic effect. As we control the mercury and capture it in the scrubber to prevent re-emission, we also assist in the water quality on your discharge side. The graph on the right-hand side just simply shows you that where the mercury is going. It shows you kind of the enrichment. And yes, I've drawn a line. It's a very poor fit. Okay, so I'm just trying to guiding your eye a little bit. The reason why the fit is not very well is because this particular water clarification unit treated several scrubber discharges at one time. And so it was always a continuous mix between various scrubber outlets. So that's where the scatter comes from, quite frankly, in that data. Point of the matter is capture it, speciate it, capture it, remove it. Okay. And I want to take a few minutes. The next technology that's coming out, quite frankly, to help you meet your SO2 emissions is going to be dry scrubbers and semi-dry scrubbers. Why is this important? Because it reduces the amount of water usage for your plant. Lower water usage is better for all of us. I'd much rather drink the water than, quite frankly, use it for a scrubber operation, quite frankly. This is a technology that we've developed. It's an inorganic sorbent. It is non-halogen, which means it does not contain any halogen to generate the oxidation or the speciation of the mercury. And it is non-carbon. It does not contain carbon. Does not contain carbon as a dispersant, an additive, a whatever. It is inorganic technology, designed specifically for dry and semi-dry scrubbers, and it achieves low emissions. Now, you've been to the papers, you've heard spray dryers, absorbers, SDA, CDSs, as they're known in the industry, do not require any additives. They get nearly 100% mercury removal. Well, they might, and I think they do in some cases. But as I'm standing up here, the chances of your unit getting 100% mercury or 90+% mercury in a commercial application, this is the extra insurance that you need. This will get you there with very little use of material. You can see this here. We compare it to carbon, and we also compare it to a dry material. that we produced as well. The bottom line here is that we've come up with a patented, unique application technology, as well as a composition of matter technology that, when applied to your spray dryer absorber, is very simple to apply, low capital cost, uses what you have in place already, except for what we need to, for our chemistry, and allows you to very quickly meet your MATS limit, very effectively. I'm not going to go through the numbers. You can see that they're fairly low. The key to the point is, in terms of balance of plant, ash passes the T-clip, does not affect your SO2 capture. It doesn't affect your downstream equipment. It doesn't affect your upstream equipment. It is non-corrosive because it is a non-halogen material, and it does not contain carbon. It is a potential solution for you when you go forward to install that SDA or CDS. It will ensure that you can get the mercury limit requirement that you're looking for. So, yeah, leave that up there, but you can read it later. I think I want to basically conclude at this point. I've pretty much used up more than my time that I intended. I just want to generally remind you that we've provided a technology that is patented. We are the patent licensees for the U.S. that allows you to get speciation, control your speciation. The key here is to control that feed rate to get the speciation that you need. No more, no less. Get to the compliance level. 8034, 8034 plus technology, scrubber additive technology that's patented that'll improve the efficiencies of your wet scrubbers. Utilize the air quality control devices that you have. Why add more to your unit operation? Why add more to your operator's concerns? And we control this now using our control monitoring devices, and we've been running successfully on units that are cycling through load changes. And we're maintaining mercury emission levels well below MATS. Water treatment is reduced and controlled. The co-benefits include selenium, and I apologize, I did not include that data here. I just don't have the time to show you everything. But it helps with selenium. It reduces localized and general corrosion as well. And we'll be happy to help you monitor that and look at that at any point. And then technology for your SDAs. Well, I look over and I don't think I've put anyone to sleep quite yet. So if you have questions, I appreciate your attention. I hope you've walked away learning something from this presentation. Thank you very much. Not for both days, no.
For today. Doctor, we're about right on time, and Dr. Keiser is going to be here for the rest of the day. So if we have questions about this stuff, I think he'd be perfectly willing to talk to you folks on one-on-one. So I would recommend you pull him aside and ask the questions. Thank you very much, very much appreciated. We're right on time, so we're going to move on to Michael Hooper, who's going to talk about implementing some of these compliance plans. Michael serves as Vice President of Major Projects for Northern Indiana Public Service Company, or NIPSCO. He's responsible for successful planning, management, and execution of the company's key construction projects in the electric generation, transmission, and distribution areas. Prior to joining NIPSCO, he was at AEP, where he was Director of Project Controls and Generation Major Projects. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the West Virginia Institute of Technology and a graduate of the Strategic Leadership Program of the Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. Please join me in welcoming Michael Hooper. If you need to get down. Yours is probably somewhere. Looks like it's coming.
It's trying. While this is loading up, here we go. There we go. Okay, so a couple of perspectives. You know, we've talked a lot about the short time frame, the philosophies, the implementation plans, the technologies. How do we get there? And a lot of this is going to funnel very quickly down to how do we get these projects implemented. If you're an owner or a utility that has maybe just a couple ACI systems to put in, probably not a big deal. If you're just now embarking on your scrubber program, it could be a big deal for your organization depending on what your capital plan has looked like over the past few years. And I guess to give a little flavor for how we feel in the most of the power industry about the EPA and this bevy of rules that they've handed us. I was in Washington, D.C. last summer, my wife and I. This was on a vacation, so we go down to the Smithsonian Institute. And we're getting ready to go into one of the museums, and I look across the road while we're waiting in line, and I say, oh, there's the EPA, this big, nice, majestic building, probably been there for years that the EPA moved into it. And I started to notice as I looked, this building had been designed with these big, grand entrances with large double doors all along the avenue there. And now all those large doors have big iron gates in front of them with big locks on them. So I'm not sure what the EPA is afraid of, but nevertheless, they have iron gates on the door now. So welcome, public. And so as we move forward, what I want to talk a little bit about was just give some, I guess, my philosophies around how do we implement these technologies? How do we get this capital plan up and running? How do we not blow our budgets? If you're in a regulated state and you have a very understanding commissioner, I'm sure he won't care if you blow past your capital estimates by 10, 20, 30, 40%, that type of thing. So we all have ratepayers and commissions that we report to, especially in a regulated environment, so it's very important that we're able to execute these projects and do them very efficiently. So generation, transmission, and distribution, there's some areas that I'm responsible for. Most of these projects are obviously generation-based, but as we heard from the FERC commissioner, they're looking for other ways, right? They're looking at transmission and how do we how we solve these seams issues between different RTOs and that type of thing. Look at things like distributed generation and down at the distribution level. So a number of areas where we may look to solve some of these problems moving forward other than just retrofit your power plant. If you're anything like NIPSCO in your organization, what we've seen is this sharp increase in capital spend. As a whole, I think prior to my joining, the last several years before that, they had averaged about $200 million in capital investment for the whole of the organization. Now, just my group alone, we're going to be over $300 million and moving north of that over the next several years as we grow in the transmission arena, grow in the distribution arena, and obviously grow in the generation arena as we look at retrofit. And the important piece at the bottom, I don't know if you caught that, but what happens, especially if you were in a Save Your Way to Prosperity utility, is that sometimes people look at their plan and they say, well, we have a $500 million or $800 million or $1 billion capital investment plan and we have to get implemented over the next 4, 5, 6 years. And they think, well, we've been doing these projects forever. We've done a lot of $10 or $20 million projects, so this is just 20 or 25 of those we have to get done, and it doesn't work that way. And we all know that you just don't step up from a $20 million project to a $500 million project and expect that the same methods and means that you executed those successfully are going to necessarily work on something that's much more complicated. And so 3 areas I want to talk about today. The first one is setting your organizational structure for success. And these are just some things. We're finishing up 2 scrubbers now, getting ready to start a 3rd one, and the 3rd one will be my 24th scrubber that I've worked on. Obviously, being at AEP, we had a huge scrubber program that I was involved in over there, and then several here at NIPSCO. So, been around the block on these scrubbers and ACI systems and bag houses and new power plants and those type of things. And these are just some little tidbits that I've picked up over those projects and those years that have helped us be successful. And as a vendor community, areas where vendors have helped us be successful as well, so it kind of goes both ways. So the first is this organizational structure. And this is from the whole project's organization, even down to the individual project itself. And three things to look for when you're talking about the people, because that's really, those are the folks that are going to implement this thing. You can have the best technology in the world, you can have all your regulatory approvals, and you can have a deadline, but if you don't have the right people on the project, you're never going to get there. And so we really look at three things when we get started. We look at the folks that are a match for the project, we look at folks that are still on the fence, and those that are not budging. And this is what I'm talking about, is your project personality, because as we know, every project has its own personality that's derived from the people, that's derived from the time pressures, cost pressures, quality issues that you may be facing, whatever's driving your project. And so when we talk about a match, we're talking about folks with the right talent for the level and complexity of project you're looking at. We're talking about the right experience or blend of experience on the project. And then we're also talking about that work effort, or what is the work ethic of your project. Because we've seen it all over the map, I've seen it all over the map, where you have sort of the slow sit back, analyze versus the let's get going, we'll worry about the drawings when they get here kind of thing. And so you have to have a good mix of that. And so the next set of folks you have are these on the fence people, right? And so they may be new to projects, they may not agree with the philosophy, they may have their own agendas that they're trying to solve. You have to ferret that out and figure out which are the folks that are on the fence that you can get converted to that match that we talked about earlier. And this is through coaching, obviously, and this clear, consistent communication, because many times the people that are on the fence, there's some communication gap there. There's something they haven't heard yet. There's some detail about the project that they're missing that will get them to that match state that you need them to be in to push the project forward. And then lastly, you have these folks that are not budging, right? It's do they have some personality mismatch with the folks, the leadership on the team? Do they have a different philosophy than what the management vision is for that project? Or do they are they folks that wish they were in a different role in the project, so they're trying to be that role even instead of the role they're supposed to be in? And what you have to do there is be decisive. And you can't let that non-match person lay around on the project too long, because I've seen too many projects that had that personality ruin the whole project because they had other agendas, or they caused rifts between the owner and the contractor and the engineer, your construction folks and your startup folks. So really be decisive on that. If you see an issue there, no matter what level of the organization you're in, be decisive and remove those non-matches, those folks that aren't budging. Remove them quickly once you really have established that, hey, it's going to take a lot of effort to get this person or this group around to where we need them. And the key there, other than making that critical early decision, is we really look for an 80% match. And this doesn't mean everyone has to think the same or everyone has to always agree. You need some challenging thoughts. You need good candor on the project. But what it does mean is you have to have at least 80% of those folks, especially on a big complex job. You have to have 80% of those folks, and that includes your contractors, your vendors and suppliers, and your engineering organizations, headed in the right direction, working together, communicating well, collaborating to ensure success. So look for that key number, and if you see that number as greater than 80% when you get started, you really need to take a step back and reassess that, because once you get into it and you're millions of dollars committed, it's difficult to back up at that point. The next piece is understanding your procurement planning. This is another area where I've seen projects get in trouble. And what I mean by that is, what are your project or program drivers? So if you're starting an ACI program, right? So an ACI project in and of itself is not terribly complicated and not terribly complex, pretty easy to solve. If you're starting on a program where you're going to put in maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 of these systems, depending on how big of an organization you have, that looks a little different, and your procurement planning looks a little different that way. So understand what's driving your project. Is it time? Is it cost? Do you have quality issues you have to meet with these regulations, right? Even though we all have a tight time frame, we're all trying to manage our budgets. really the key issue here is from a quality standpoint. It doesn't do you any good to get this installed in time if you can't meet your requirement or meet your limit. So understand your project drivers and really spend a lot of time up front. You know, we all talk about project charters and project plans, and it's popular to say we charter the project, we develop a project plan because that's the PMI thing to say, and it's very popular now. I'll guarantee if you really spend the time up front to get your construction and startup and commissioning folks in there, your engineer and your suppliers involved up front, polling them around what's going to drive my project and get all their perspectives, that you'll come up with a better list of risks to start with, and you have a better contract structure and a better procurement plan going forward. Second is obviously market condition. With this tight time frame, all of us that lived through the tight market conditions, especially when we were building a lot of scrubbers back in 06, 07, and 08, we don't want to relive that. We're all out there testing the market, trying to understand commodity risks, understand engineering and vendor supply issues that are out there. And so far, things look okay. But when everyone says things look okay, it's typically when we turn around one day and they're not okay and lead times double and that type of thing. So understand your market condition. I've heard lots of people say that, well, we'll just write it into the contract. Well, if anyone's lived in that pipe dream before, sometimes it works. 99% of the time it doesn't work, right? Because at some point when you just hit a limit and you get saturated, it doesn't matter what kind of contract you have, you just can't get there from here. Organizational culture, so understand that. This is one of those, what I'll call tidbits is, I'll go back to my days at AEP, and if anyone in here has worked with AEP, they'll get a nice laugh out of this, but AEP is a very hands-on, especially on the generation side, a very hands-on, very invasive culture. They want to be involved in every project. Every project that I worked on at AEP that was an EPC or a firm price, AEP had as many people on the project as the contractor did or the engineering firm did. Their culture is not, we'll give you a good scope, you bid the work, you go install the project, and we'll have a couple people there as an interface. Contrary to that, I remember visiting a project out in Wyoming, and I think it was a Pacificor plant, where they had a dry scrubber being built firm price. And so we go out to visit. We were looking at one of the vendors out there and doing some assessment. And I'm asking, like, hey, where's the corporate representative folks? Where's the owner? Well, they have one guy, but he sits over there, and he comes over once a week for a meeting. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, are you serious? They really trust you guys with this? And that project was very successful, and it went very well. But the owner knew how to be hands-off, to how just to set up the project correctly, get the right vendor in there, and be successful with it. AEP just doesn't have that culture. So know your organization's culture, and if don't get yourself into a contract that doesn't match your organization's culture, because you're going to fight it the whole way. You're going to fight it the whole way, and you're probably going to make your contractors or your vendors very inefficient by doing that. And then lastly, those hidden risks. Okay, so we all, when we do this, our stakeholder identification, if you did that over 100 projects and asked people to do it, you could probably pull all those documents together, and 90% of all those stakeholders are the same, because we're in the same industry. We all say it's ratepayers, it's regulators, it's our vendors, it's the board, it's shareholders. Those are sort of generic stakeholders. They're all very important, but look at that hidden risk. Understand, are you building a scrubber on Lake Michigan at a power plant that's in the middle of town, or are you building a scrubber in rural Indiana that has 3,000 or 4,000 acres of property, and the only way to see the thing is from the air, right? So understand those little hidden risks and build that into your plan. Build that into your plan, especially if you're talking about program type of activities where you're doing the same project at multiple sites or multiple areas. What are the differences? What are the subtle differences that change this project from this one, and that could either save money or cost you more money? That's what we spend most of our time on, is not so much the generic stakeholders, but what are the subtle differences between this location and that location. Generation, yes, especially when you get in the transmission and distribution arena. That's where those hidden risks really jump out at you. And then lastly, these 4 pillars of project management that when we talk about managing risk, looking across all 4. Once again, there's nothing here that's new that we haven't heard about, but it's those little things, it's those the devil in the details that we need to be aware of. So the 4 pillars are the philosophy that starts at the management level. Then we talk about the people. I've spoke a little bit about that and getting that right match. Your processes, right? So if we all seen the triangle of success where you have experienced management, experienced people, well-documented and established processes. So the theory says that if you have any 2 of those, you can be successful. If you have all 3, you have virtually guaranteed success. But if you're missing 2 of those, you're going to fail. So if you have very experienced people, but your processes aren't well documented, you have good management, you can still be successful. The people know what to do. Same thing, inexperienced people, but well-documented processes, they don't need the experience because you're guiding them. You get the point. So when we talk about process, what we found is because there's a lot of turnover in this industry now, project management, skill sets, good construction management, good startup and commissioning folks are in high demand, a lot of moving back and forth. You really need to concentrate on writing things down and developing your processes because those folks, those resources, the people piece, none of that's guaranteed. None of that's guaranteed. So if you have the process written down in place and you have good management direction on the philosophy line, then you're probably going to be successful in your projects. And lastly, this technology piece that gets left out a little bit, and I'll speak just a minute about that. So tying back to those 4 pillars, that vision and strategy has to come from the senior leadership. If the senior leadership believes in project management, if they enforce it, if they don't let you kind of do it sometimes, but when it gets too hard, or man, I just don't want to sit down and go through another project review meeting, or I don't want to read this project charter and look for issues. I don't really want to dig into this project, to this business plan and see what it really does to the balance sheet. If management gets lazy around project management, if senior management gets lazy around it, then the folks executing the projects are going to follow that same lead, and they're going to get lazy around it, and sooner or later, it's going to cost you money. It's going to cost you money because you're going to miss one. You may go along and get 8 out of 10 of them right, but those last 2 may be the one that gets you in trouble. And as we've seen across the country, and Indiana being no different, it only takes one miss, especially a bad one, to really ruin your reputation with your regulator. And once that reputation gets marred, it takes a long, long, long time to get that back. And so if you have a reputation for success, a reputation for good project management, and your senior leadership say that's the vision, we're going to enforce it, and we're going to follow it, and we're going to support it, it pays dividends all the way down the line. Second is that skill set, making sure you have the right skill set. Sometimes you have to pay for it, but I can tell you in the long run, it's worth it. And that match piece I talked about. Don't get this big personality mismatch on your project. If startup hates construction and construction hates project management and the engineering folks don't talk to anybody else on the project, you're going to have problems. It seems simple, but how many projects have you walked through where you said, well, this guy didn't know that or she didn't hear that? How do we miss that, right? And it seems simple. It takes a lot of hard work to make sure that communication loop happens, and having the right people on the project or having that congruent project personality will solve a lot of those issues for you. The process piece, documented and consistent. Don't have different processes on every project. I don't know how many folks in the room can raise their hand and say that our cost management and our forecasting tools and our cost sheets look exactly the same on every project. No matter how complex the project may be or how simple the project may be. We may not fill in all the blocks, but if we go from project to project to project, I can ask this project manager and this project manager, and they're going to give me the exact same information in the exact same format when they're talking about forecasting costs. It's very hard to do because everyone has their own way of doing it. We need to make sure that things are well documented and that they're consistent, because that way it gives you portability amongst projects. And lastly is technology. The 3 E's of project controls, being a project controls guy, having run a large project controls organization at AEP, is you want to be easy, efficient, and effective. right? So we need to make sure that whatever systems we're asking the folks on the projects to use, they need to be easy to use. If they're hard and cumbersome to use, people will find some other way. We need to make sure that they're efficient. Today, we want to be able to crunch large volumes of data. We want to be able to push lots of data from our schedules, from our quantity surveyors, from our engineering information. We want to be able to pull costs from all different facets of the project and then very efficiently crunch it and produce reports, right? And we need to do that very quickly because we want to be able to affect change quickly. So make sure that your systems are efficient. And lastly, neither of the first two are really worth a darn if you're not effective with it, meaning that management, either at the project level or up through the organization, can't make effective decisions based on the information that you've provided. If it's hard to discern, if it all looks different on different projects, if the folks don't understand what to do with the data, then all this other is for naught because it's all about making the right decision at the right time. So the benefit of all this, the benefit of investing in technology to upgrade your systems, to be able to crunch the data, the benefit of getting the right talent in your organization and paying them enough to stay around and removing the roadblocks so their job is easy to complete. Maybe not an easy job, but the job's easy to complete. The benefit of spending the time to document your processes and get them the same. I mean, that's like, pencil in the eye type stuff because it's just so arduous to get it all written down and get everybody trained and on the same path. What's the benefit? Why do we want to do that? Why do we want to go through all that effort? The benefit is the risk piece. When I first came to NIPSCO and saw the bevy of projects they had to get done and the time frame they had to get done, we sat down with the executive council and I said, hey, we probably have a 20 to 30% risk of not fully executing this plan based on what I see in the time guidelines and the dollars we had. We went to work. We had to go back to the Regulatory Commission to get some changes in our CPCN certificates for a couple of the scrubbers. We've implemented some new technology to help drive communication and consolidate data. We brought in a ton of new talent. We've trained up a lot of our internal talent, and I really think now we're down below 10%, really across the board, probably below 5%. So I feel comfortable now, right? I've driven something that was probably a P70, P80 down to like a P95. And so I sleep better at night. And so they rewarded by just giving you more work, right? We'll just have more projects. We'll give you enough work that it'll get back up to P80. But the point being is the devil's in the details. There's some little things there that you can look at that really can help turn the coin from an unsuccessful program to a very successful program for your organization, for your ratepayers, for your shareholders, and you'll get recognized for that, I'm sure. Thanks.
All right, any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate it very much. Before we go on break, I'd like to give you a little bit of homework. We've got the panel discussion, and this is going to be a little bit unlike some of the other panel discussions. The panelists are not going to do presentations. We're going to go directly into questions and directly having an interactive presentation. You all have pads of paper and pens that the hotel has put out. So if you have questions for the panel, and we're going to be talking about the implications and contingencies involved with the EPA regs and other environmental regs that are coming in. So if you have questions, if you could just take 2 seconds, either before or after the break, write down what your questions are for the panelists, and you can just put them right here at the end of the desk, and we'll make sure that they get asked throughout the hour. Other than that, I think we're ready for the break, and if you guys could be back at about 11:20, that should give you plenty of time to get some refreshments and answer emails and phone calls. So thanks very much, and we'll see you back here at 11:20.